Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. I'm Kritika Sen Chakraborty, and I'm from the Department of Economics, University of New Mexico. And I am going to be on the job market this fall, but this is not my job market paper. So this is another chapter of my dissertation, and this is preliminary work, but any comments or suggestions are welcome. I'm writing this paper with my advisor, Dr. Kira Villa. And we are, in this paper, we are working on the effects of rainfall shocks on adolescent schoolwork decisions in rural South Africa. So as is well documented, climate change is projected to have adverse effects, particularly in poorer regions such as the sub-Saharan Africa, in which most of the economies have high dependence on rain-fed agriculture. And in such economies, households employ a number of coping strategies, of which one of the most important coping strategies are adjusting the human capital investments of their children and adolescents. Now, this problem is pertinent in sub-Saharan Africa, which has the highest proportion of out-of-school children across all ages and around 28 million out-of-school adolescents as of 2018. And so the long-term effects of climate shocks in early childhood are well documented. However, the period of adolescence, which is from ages 11 to 19, is also marked by important physical and socioeconomic transitions. For example, during this period, adolescents increasingly begin to take adult roles and responsibilities and transition from school to work. However, this period is especially more important because shocks in mid-childhood might result in school discontinuation, where children might again begin schooling after recovering from shocks. However, shocks in adolescence might have effects such as school termination, which can again have long-lasting, irreversible impacts in terms of human capital accumulation. However, robust evidence exploring the impact of negative weather events during adolescence is scarce in the literature. And so the objective of our paper is to examine the effect of agricultural productivity shocks proxied by rainfall shocks on the schoolwork decisions of adolescents and young adults in rural South Africa. For the purpose of this paper, I'm just going to refer to them as adolescents. South Africa presents a compelling case because it is located in a drought belt and it has experienced exacerbated drought conditions in recent years. And so another avenue that we explore in this paper is whether household wealth mitigates the effects of extreme weather events on human capital decisions of adolescents in rural South Africa. So a little bit of background. Like these kinds of environmental or agricultural productivity shocks can affect schoolwork decisions through two channels. So one is the direct income or the production effect, whereby rainfall shocks can, favorable rainfall conditions increase the household income of agrarian households. And so it can lead to increase in human capital investments of children. However, favorable rainfall conditions can also have an indirect effect, whereby increased rainfall affects the shadow wages of labor. And so this increase in the opportunity cost of schooling can have opposite effects. And so the overall effect on schoolwork decisions depends on which of the channels dominate. So if the credit constraints dominate, then negative rainfall shocks would increase the probability of young adults entering the labor force and dropping out of school. Whereas if the opportunity cost channel dominates, negative rainfall shocks can have a positive effect on school enrollment. And so a priori, the net effect of such shocks on schoolwork decisions is ambiguous. And so it is even more policy relevant to understand whether such agricultural productivity shocks can improve or hamper human capital accumulation. So the data that we use for this study is from the National Income Dynamics Study, South Africa. This is a nationally representative longitudinal survey of households available for 5 periods from 2008 to 2017. And The sample that we consider for this study it comprises of adolescents and young adults aged 14 to 23. But for ease, I'm just going to refer to them as adolescents. Okay. The outcomes that we consider here are school enrollment, whether the particular adolescent was enrolled in school at the time of the survey. And then we also consider real education expenditures for the last 30 days. And so one of the problems in other data sets of developing countries is that we have availability of household level education expenditures, but the NIDS provides us education expenditures for every child and adolescent in the household. And so this education expenditure is an aggregation of expenditures on books, stationery, schooling fees, transportation allowances, and other related expenditures. And so we use this aggregated education expenditure and convert it to real terms. Now, regarding the labor market decisions, we consider labor market participation on the extensive and intensive margins. For the extensive margin, we look at whether the adolescent currently is engaged in any income generating activity. And for the intensive margin, we consider hours worked per week. Now, to account for zeros in the real education expenditures and hours worked per week, we use the inverse hyperbolic sign transformation. For the climate indicators, I consider the precipitation data from the Climate Hazards Group infrared precipitation with station data. This is a very rich data set available for 30 years. And this is mainly used for agricultural drought monitoring. So it offers very accurate precipitation data. And I'm not going to go into too much of detail, but I match this precipitation data using the geographical coordinates of the 52 district councils at the district by year level. And so using that information, I create my main variable of interest, which is standardized rainfall for each district. And I consider the total rainfall during the primary growing season of South Africa, which is October of the previous year to March of the current year. And so I consider this as the growing season because South Africa's staple crop, which is maize, it's grown during this season, and there's huge evidence that rainfall during this period significantly affects the yields of maize, which is the most important crop grown in rural South Africa. And so we consider rainfall shocks during the growing season as the relevant measure of an agricultural productivity shock. And so I subtract the long-term average rainfall during this period for the last 30 years, and then divide it by the standard deviation for this long-term distribution. And so what we get is basically the standard deviations relative to the long-term mean rainfall. And so negative values would represent drier conditions and positive values would represent wetter conditions. We also control for the monthly temperature and also standardize it at the district level. And I get this data from the ERA 5 product of the European Center for Medium Range Weather Forecasts. So the identification strategy in our paper is based on spatial and temporal variations in rainfall. And as we can see from this map, from these figures, that there is random temporal and spatial variation in rainfall across South Africa, where the darker regions represent rainfall, standardized rainfall above 1 standard deviation, and the lightest ones are below 1 standard deviation from the long-term means. And so, here we've shown the rainfall, which is measured during the growing season, that is October of previous year to March of the current year. And like I said, rainfall shocks are a relevant measure of agricultural productivity shocks because there is a very strong relationship between the maize production and the average rainfall trends in South Africa. And so we see, although they're not perfectly correlated, but yeah, there's a very strong positive correlation between them. So this table presents the summary statistics of the main variables that are used. So as I've said earlier, the dependent variables are school enrollment, labor market participation, and then we also have school expenditure, education expenditures, and average weekly hours working. And among the weather characteristics, we have standardized rainfall. Now, in addition to the current year rainfall, we also consider the lagged rainfall, which is rainfall in the previous agricultural season. And I'm going to talk about it in my later slides as well. And so both these have a negative means, which shows that during the study period, most of rural South Africa experienced drier conditions relative to the long-term mean. And then we have a couple of some of control variables such as age, gender, child dependency ratio, household size, and household wealth index. So to estimate the causal effect of rainfall shocks, we employ a linear individual fixed effects model. And we exploit the exogenous within individual variation in exposure to rainfall over age, which means we are comparing adolescents in ages when they were exposed to relatively higher rainfall with ages when they were exposed to lower rainfall. So Y is the outcome of adolescent I at age A in district D in survey period T. And rainfall is the standardized district level rainfall. And then the contemporaries rainfall can affect the schoolwork decisions based on the expected household revenue. However, the schoolwork decisions can also be impacted by the revenues earned by the household in the previous agricultural season. And to account for that, we also include the rainfall in the previous agricultural season, which is the lagged rainfall. X is a vector of individual and household characteristics. And then to account for individual unobserved heterogeneity, we have individual fixed effects, lambda I. We also control for the age fixed effects with gamma A and the survey year fixed effects. To control for any kind of seasonality in the labor markets as well as the schooling decisions, we also control for the month fixed effects. So this table presents the main results from our paper. And so we see that standardized rainfall in the current agricultural period increases the probability of school enrollment by 2.78 percentage points. And it also increases education expenditures by 21.7%. And so we see that current period rainfall has a pro-cyclical effect on human capital investments of adolescents and young adults. And so while we have positive effects on education outcomes, we see that instead adolescents are more likely to allocate time from work towards schooling. And so standardized rainfall in the current period, it decreases the probability of labor market participation by 1.87 percentage points, although the coefficient is weakly statistically significant. But for work intensity, we see a negative effect of current period standardized rainfall. Now, when we look at rainfall in the previous agricultural season, we see that it does not have any statistically significant effect on school enrollment and education expenditures, but it does have effects on the labor market participation on the extensive and intensive margins. And these effects are opposite to what we observe for the current period rainfall. And so lagged rainfall is likely to have a pro-cyclical effect on labor market outcomes of these adolescents. And all these models include like individual fixed effects and age fixed effects and year fixed effects as discussed earlier. Now, when we try to see whether there are any differential effects by the gender of the adolescent or the young adult, we include interactions of standardized rainfall in the current and in the lagged period with an indicator for female. But if we look at the coefficients for the interaction terms, none of them are significant. And so which tells us that rainfall shocks do not differentially affect male and female adolescents. Now, the bottom two rows, these show us the marginal effects of both current and lagged rainfall for the female adolescents. And for most of the outcomes, we see that the results are similar to what we observe for the male adolescents. And so overall, we infer that agricultural productivity shocks proxied by rainfall shocks, they do not differentially affect males or females. And so there's not likely to be any gender bias in household responses to such shocks. To understand whether household wealth, which is a proxy for access to credit facilities and savings, whether that mitigates the effect of such shocks on the schoolwork decisions, we again have an interaction with household wealth. And so in these figures, I show the average marginal effects of rainfall shocks on each of the outcomes across the household wealth index. And so for school enrollment, we see that among females, there does not seem to be any mitigating effect of household wealth. But for males, we see that for males belonging to poorer households, there are positive effects of rainfall in the current period on school enrollment. However, these effects are attenuated for those belonging to wealthier households, which tells us that male adolescents are better shielded from the effects of current rainfall shocks on school enrollment. However, females are not, their school enrollment is not sensitive depending on the wealth of the household. When we look at education expenditures, the most striking thing over here is when we look at the effects of lagged rainfall. So the lagged rainfall has negative effects on female education expenditures for those belonging to poorer households. And this is also consistent with the effects of lagged rainfall on labor market participation. And so we see the exact opposite effect on labor market participation for females belonging to poorer households. So basically lagged rainfall has positive effects on labor market participation, both on the extensive and on the intensive margins. And so poorer households are likely to reduce expenditures on education and instead push the female adolescents into the labor market. And so we conduct a couple of validity checks and robustness checks. And so we find that rainfall deviations do not significantly predict any of the household or individual level characteristics. And so they are plausibly exogenous shocks. And then we also consider some alternative definitions of rainfall. We also include province fixed effects, which do not change our results. Then we also consider a falsification test where we use future rainfall variability as the treatment variable, which we expect should exert no influence on the schoolwork decisions. And that's what we find. And again, our results are unlikely to be affected by attrition over the 5 years over the 5 periods that we consider. And so just to summarize, the main results from our paper are that current rainfall shocks induce changes in the schoolwork decisions of adolescents driven by the credit constraint channel. However, rainfall shocks in the previous agricultural season affect labor decisions through the increase in the opportunity cost or the opportunity cost of schooling. And although we are still exploring this, but this might partly be because of the ability of households to transfer wealth from the previous period to the current period, which has opposite effects on labor market outcomes. And then regarding the heterogeneity across wealth, we find that the effects of current rainfall on school enrollment are attenuated for males from wealthier households. However, for female adolescents, we see that household wealth attenuates the effect of lagged rainfall on labor outcomes. And so in credit-constrained agrarian households, transitory agricultural shocks can substantially affect these schoolwork decisions, as we demonstrate in this study. And so policy interventions targeting adolescents at these sensitive periods of human capital formation, especially in the face of these adverse events, can help recover some of the loss in human capital accumulation. And this also implies better access to credit facilities, which can, to some extent, mitigate the impacts of negative shocks on schoolwork transitions and enable households to better cope with such shocks. With that, I would like to conclude. Yeah, thank you.
So what we're gonna do, like discussion little thing first, or we're gonna open up for questions?
Yeah, whatever. Oh, okay.
Okay, I must preface this that we were told very soon before the conference that we had to read each other's papers, and so I apologize, but I did not do like a thorough read of your paper, but I skimmed through it a little bit. First of all, I really enjoyed learning about the topic. I thought it was, I love learning about these new, studies that are being done. And I think the study that you're doing has really important policy implications. And so I really enjoyed that. I think the main thing that for me, I was still like unclear after kind of skimming, and there's probably more about it in the paper that I didn't get to, but this lagged price effect or the lagged range fall effect, like I didn't really understand the mechanism through what's the explanation for that? I know you say there's like a shadow price effect on the wages or something like that. Can you explain a little more like in depth, like why are we seeing, different effects in the current period versus the previous period? Because when I was reading it, I was expecting there to be like the same sign of the effects,
Right.
but maybe the lag would be like a smaller magnitude or something. So I think for me, like when I was skimming, right? So that I would have liked to have like a more direct, like this is exactly what's going on with this, and this is why we're finding that. So that was like the main thing that like kind of stood out to me. The other thing that kind of came to mind is that so you're using a clustered standard error in your analysis, right. And so in order for clustered standard errors to be valid for inference, there has to be no correlation between the errors in across clusters. Mm-hmm. And so basically, when you have geographical regions that are very close to each other, right? Mm-hmm. So you have these districts and they're all adjacent to each other, right?
Right.
So my concern would be that there would be correlation across the geographical spaces, and that would render inference based on clustered standard errors invalid. And so one thing I would do is I would suggest testing for what's called cross-sectional dependence, which will provide basically like you either pass the test or you don't. And if you don't, then one alternative is to use what's called Driscoll standard errors, and they basically correct for cross-sectional dependence or across cluster dependence, mm-hmm. And they also correct for like serial correlation. So that's like the only thing that kind of stood out, the only two things that stood out. But otherwise, I really enjoyed reading the paper or skimming through it and learning about the results. It was good.
Thank you so much. Yeah, so you have like your points are valid, and like regarding the first point, I think that is the thing that we are trying to explore more about why we see opposite effects on labor outcomes when it comes to lagged versus the current. And you're absolutely right. In most of the previous studies which do use lagged rainfall, they see like coefficients in the same direction. And so, like I said, this might be partly because households are able to transfer wealth across periods. And so if in the previous period, a positive rainfall shock increase the probability of labor market participation, but if they are able to transfer household wealth to the next period, then the shock would have a positive effect on schooling. Like they might pull their children from the labor market into schooling. Okay. So
I'm
yeah, but
also,
you're absolutely right about that.
Price effect too, so is there potentially an omitted price variable that's maybe driving that somehow? You might think about exploring, like putting in some kind of price index, because you could think of like if there's a shock in this period, mm-hmm. and there's a bunch of you know, maize being grown, then that could
Mhm.
potentially like depress the wages, and then
Right.
that would have implications for the future period or something too. So that might be like one explanation for why you're seeing that.
Okay, yeah, Kira would like to say something. Go on.
I'm gonna add a comment.
Okay,
Like, as we're hearing this conversation, like,
Mhm.
one of the things that I'm thinking and something that we can look into is possibly like, you know, the lag period might make, like, returns to farm, right, like, good rainfall last year maybe makes the returns to our farm more, like, higher, right? And so now, like, the returns to transitioning into labor are higher, like, having your adolescent work on the farm, for example, is now higher. So we should probably look into that by like maybe the types of work they're entering into. And
Right.
just like maybe it's a returns to labor story increasing. That's not realized in the current period, but it's like the next period.
Yeah, or maybe the farms in the one period like made a bunch of money, and so now they have more money to spend, or.
Right, well,
Yeah.
I mean, also farm production decisions, right, there's, right, like the.
Yeah, it's over time.
Right, exactly, and so, production decisions are already made once the good rainfall is, been realized, and so now the good rainfall is making your is influencing your production decisions for the next period.
right, yeah. Yeah, we can certainly try, yeah, look
We
into
don't-
that, yeah.
We get to talk later, so.
Yeah. Yeah, and for the clustering of standard errors, I can try doing that, but like in most of the studies that I've come across, they've clustered standard errors at the village or the district level. But I can certainly look into like the cross-sectional dependence
I
part.
mean,
Yeah.
it might not be it might be a non-issue for publication, but I
Okay.
mean, in terms of like,
Sure.
you know, valid inference, it's just something
Sure.
to consider.
Yeah, I can try that, yeah, thank you.
I just have a quick question.
Oh.
Didn't talk about like the magnitude, like, that thought like there it's not percent, like, so you can discuss like what's the median in the community, like, because I think the rainfall area, how big is that fact?
Okay, right.
If this is sometimes like how big is it? Like,
Yes.
how big is it? Decrease on the.
Yeah. Yeah, in terms of magnitude, the effect is not very high because we see that about 68% of the sample is currently enrolled in school, and we see an effect of somewhere around like 2.7 percentage points, which is not a very big magnitude. And also if we consider like labor market participation. But I've seen in a couple of previous studies, they also don't find like very effects which are high in magnitude. Yeah, but you're absolutely right. Yeah, they're not high.
3% of
Yeah, it's very.
like all those things, right?
Mhm.
It's still a little bit you need to like consider about like maybe there's two directions. Maybe rainfall have some negative effect as well, but like there's also positive effect, and then you see more positive effect out of the results. I just think if there's like you can clearly like
Right.
so they can post like things like that, and overall.
Yes.
I mean, what do you have right now?
No, that's a great point. Yeah, I can work on those magnitudes and certainly include that in my paper. Thank you. Are there any more questions? Okay. So, yeah, I think, yeah, I'm done. Thank you so much.
How do I make this full screen here? I'm not familiar. Can you pull that up?
So you do, I think I have your,
Dollar store YouTube.
no, not, so let me just open yours.
Oh, yeah, that's
So you do Shadow, I think, yeah. So just, oh, did you put it?
it's over there. in Chinese.
Oh, yeah, okay.
I'm
Let-
sorry. I said-
Open.
I see, gotcha.
Yeah, and then you do the view. And you do,
Perfect.
then I think it's.
Great. Hi, everyone. My name is Zach Rutledge. I'm a postdoctoral research scholar at Arizona State University. I'll be presenting a paper that I'm doing with my co-author, Joaquin Mayorga, who's a PhD candidate in the agribusiness department at ASU, the Morrison School of Agribusiness. And so we're going to be presenting our paper today. We're going to co-present. I'll start off and then he'll come up here and take over at a certain point. So our paper is called Chinese Trade Competition and Rural Mexican Migration. And so to provide some background on basically what we're doing, in 2001, China gained access to the World Trade Organization. And basically what happened was there was a significant reduction in barriers to trade for China. And so this has been documented to induce a lot of foreign direct investment in the country that boosted Chinese exports throughout the world and especially to the United States. And so basically what we're going to be looking at is how this shock in supply of manufacturing goods basically how did it impact Mexican manufacturing employment, and then ultimately how does that affect the migration and sectoral employment decisions of rural Mexican workers. And so our main research question is basically how did the rise of Chinese manufacturing exports exactly impact sectoral and geographic employment decisions of rural Mexicans, just to reiterate. So why is this important? First of all, it's allowing us to provide some insight into what are the secondary effects of trade competition globally. So particularly if we're looking at developing economies, we're kind of providing some insight into how these types of trade pressures might impact the development process. And then so for example, increased trade competition with Mexico might have worsened the employment opportunities that are there. And so that might slow the development process for Mexico in particular, but more generally, perhaps in other contexts too. And then we're also going to be looking at how trade pressures have impacted migration patterns in Mexico. And then kind of a secondary thing we'll be looking at is to try to provide some insight into whether these types of migration pressures that we're going to see were either potentially beneficial or potentially even harmful to the host country or the receiving country, which is the U.S. in the context of Mexico. If many of you may not be aware, but the U.S. is facing a labor crisis in the agricultural sector. So we're going to be exploring whether these trade pressures have contributed to trying to partially resolving that issue, or whether it may have led to new competition with other low-skilled workers in the U.S. And we're not going to really quantify that, but we're going to make a big leap there and say that maybe there might have been something happening there. So what we're going to do is we start with this kind of utility maximization framework where basically, I'm not going to get into all the notation here too quickly, but basically we're looking at an individual's decision whether they're going to either stay working in a particular location and sector, or whether they're going to move to a different location and sector. So we're going to be looking specifically between manufacturing and agriculture, and then Mexico and the US. And within Mexico, we're going to be looking at the decision for the rural Mexican worker to stay in their village, or to migrate elsewhere in Mexico, or to migrate to the US. And then we'll basically just be looking at non-agricultural work in agricultural work. So we're kind of framing the derivation of our empirical framework in the context of this utility maximization setup, where utility is just going to be proxied by the net income, basically, of either working here or there, either in the sector or location. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be modeling the income function, the gross income function, as a function of individual observable variables, and then a sectoral employment rate, where J and K denote either the sector or the location, basically. And then we'll have a cost function that enters into our net income function, which basically is going to be a function of observable variables again, and then the physical distance of moving. So if a person stays in, say, their rural village or wherever they were surveyed, then basically the cost of moving is zero, essentially. But in the context of a move, either sectorally or geographically, there may be some kind of cost. So what we do is we basically kind of transform that decision into basically a 0-1 migrate or don't migrate, or stay in the sector or don't stay in the sector. And it's basically going to be either based on the net income being greater in one option versus the other. And so if it's not greater, then of course they won't move. So kind of fast forwarding a little bit here, we're basically just rearranging the math, whether this decision is produces greater income than the other decision, and kind of boiling it down to a very simple kind of linear probability model, essentially. And then so really what we're interested in is looking at the impact of the change in the probability that results from a change in the employment rate in the manufacturing sector in Mexico. And so I'll let Joaquin take over from here.
So that was the theoretical framework, and now I'm going to talk about the empirical model that we estimate to analyze this question. So what we do is we regress labor migration decisions by rural Mexicans on the change in the manufacturing share of labor at the state level and a set of controls. More specifically, on the left-hand side, we have a set of binary variables that are equal to 100 if the individual from state S in region R works in a location, which can be the home locality elsewhere in Mexico or the US, and the sector, which is either agriculture or non-agriculture in a given year T, which is going to be either 2003 or 2008. Otherwise, this set of variables is equal to 0. Our main regressor of interest is the percentage point change in the manufacturing share of the non-agricultural labor force between the initial year, 1998, before China's accession to the WTO, and a year T in the future, 2003 or 2008, in a given Mexican state. Our controls include individual characteristics, municipality level characteristics, such as the distance between the municipality and the US, and state level controls that are relevant for this case, like the poverty level, the poverty rate at the state level. We also control for a set of Mexican region fixed effects, where a region is a multi-state area within the country. This framework has endogeneity concerns. In particular, there is an omitted variable bias from unobserved shocks to US labor demand for Mexican unskilled labor. So to deal with these endogeneity issues, what we do is we exploit variations in the share of manufacturing labor in Mexico driven by shocks to Chinese manufacturing export supply. So in particular, we focus on the portion of the variation in the Mexican manufacturing share of non-agricultural work that depends on a measure of exposure to trade. So what we do is we borrow an instrument from the literature. Specifically, we borrow an instrument from AAEA Insights paper by Melissa Dell and co-authors, where trade exposure consists of an instrument with two components. The first component, and we are summing across industries. The first component is the state's share of manufacturing labor of the state with respect to entire Mexico. And the second component is the predicted growth in Chinese exports to the US in a given industry. This is a Bartik instrument where the exogeneity or the exclusion restriction is driven by the exogenous shock to Chinese export supply growth. We are still working out the details as to whether the first component of the instrument satisfies exclusion restriction. So that's why we are also exploring implementing the Niver-Rosin imperfect instrument approach under the assumption that the correlation between the dependent variable and our instrument is smaller than the correlation between the dependent variable and the endogenous regressor. To implement this model, we get data from the National Survey of Rural Households from Mexico, the NRUM, which was gathered by UC Davis. And we also get data on the distance from Mexican municipalities to the US from Google Maps, or all of our manufacturing labor measures at the state and industry level, where the industry is measured at the 4-digit ISIC level, come from the Mexican Economic Census, which is a survey of every single economic establishment in Mexico, gathered every 5 years. And finally, our data on Chinese exports to the US comes from the United Nations Comtrade tool. This is a map that shows the location of all the villages in our sample. And we see that every single multi-state region in Mexico contains one village in our sample, which gives us enough variation to estimate our model. Here, this table shows descriptive statistics in our sample, some household or individual level controls, such as age, education, a dummy variable equal to 1 if the worker is female. This is a database that consists of all the working age population in our sample. That is people from 15 to 65 years of age. And we also have data on the work location, where about 40% of the working age population work in their home locality, 6% elsewhere in Mexico, and 8% in the US. We also see that the average worker or working age person in our sample lives in a state that experienced a decline in the manufacturing share of non-agricultural labor of 3 percentage points, and that the average working age person in our sample experienced a growth in trade exposure or competition to Chinese export equal to $6,000. So under the assumption that our instrument satisfies exclusion restrictions, I'm going to show the results first in the short term, then I'm going to talk about what happens in the long term. So for the short term, we focus on the 5-year period between 1999 and 2003. And what we see in the first panel is that the manufacturing decline in Mexico increased the probability, manufacturing decline in Mexico decreased the probability of migrating within Mexico and increased the probability of migrating to the US. For agriculture, we don't see a statistically significant impact, but we find that evidence that a small number of rural Mexicans migrated to the US in response to manufacturing decline in Mexico. And finally, we see that the majority of the migration to the US was to do work in the non-agricultural sector. Looking at the quantitative effects, we see that a 10 percentage point decrease in the manufacturing share of non-agricultural labor decreased internal migration, that is moving to elsewhere in Mexico, by 11 percentage points, and increased migration to the US by 23 percentage points, where 17 percentage points of that effect correspond to migrating to do non-agricultural work. Now, with respect to the long-term effects, we see some dissipation of the effects as the impact of declining manufacturing continues to occur towards migration elsewhere in Mexico, but it's no longer significant for migration to the US in general. However, if we look at the third panel, we see that manufacturing decline is still increasing the probability of migrating to the US to do non-agricultural work. So if we look at the quantitative effects, we see that a 10 percentage point decrease in the manufacturing share of non-agricultural labor decreases internal migration by 16 percentage points and increases the chances of working in US non-agriculture by 9 percentage points. So in general, we find that the effect of declining manufacturing in Mexico dissipates over time, but is still present in the long term, 10 years after the Chinese export growth began. And more generally, both in the short term and in the long term, we see evidence of substitution between US migration and working outside the home locality in Mexico. There are also interesting findings with respect to the relationship between our controls and the chances of migrating to the US to work. Something interesting that we find is that education or years of schooling is positively related with the chances of migrating to the US. This is similar to other findings in the literature. We also find that higher child-adult ratios at the household level are negatively associated with migrating to the US to do work. And finally, we see that the state's poverty rate is negatively associated with staying in the home locality to do work. And also it's positively related with the probability of migrating elsewhere in Mexico to do work. So this is our main results. This is still a work in progress, and we look forward to hear your thoughts on this. So I will hand in the presentation to Zach. Thank you.
So let's see. So I'm basically just going to kind of conclude here with an overview of what we're finding and kind of quantify essentially the average effect over the time periods that we felt. So our main effects are kind of felt in this seen in the short term between 1998 and 2003. And so over that period of time, as Joaquin mentioned, the average change in the employment share in manufacturing declined by about 3.8 percentage points. And so that average decline corresponds to about an 8.8 percentage point increase in migration to the US, about a 6.5 percentage point increase to non-farm jobs in the US between 1998 and 2003, but over the longer term corresponds to about half that, about 3.6 percentage points. So overall, we were generally unable to find statistically significant or convincing evidence that there was a lot of movement into agriculture in the US, which was kind of where we started this project from, was to try to see if there was a movement into agriculture. So we didn't really find much evidence of that, but what we did find is really that the Chinese trade competition had driven workers from Mexico to seek work in non-farm sectors of the US. And so that could potentially have increased competition for low-skilled workers in the US and likely did not significantly help resolve the American farm labor crisis that we're seeing. So that's kind of the basis of what we found from our preliminary analysis, and we look forward to your thoughts. Thanks. With that,
So thank you, Zach and Joaquin. I think this is a very interesting paper on the effects of Chinese trade competition on rural Mexican migration. And I really think that the policy implications in terms of movement into the agricultural versus non-agricultural sector in the US is super important. So as mentioned, like due to time constraints, I don't have too many comments, but so I'll just skip over the summary part of this. But like my first comment is about, so in the tables you do show the statistic, but just to like mention it explicitly in the paper regarding like the two conditions for validity of the instrument. So if you could just mention about the relevance condition. And I think your instrument does satisfy that from the tables that I see. So if you could just mention that. And my main concern with the instrument is something which could potentially violate the exclusion restriction, because like rightly mentioned, like the Chinese trade competition did affect the US manufacturing sector, but then it has also directly affected the labor market in Mexico, because like both Mexico and China are like labor intensive. They have labor intensive industries, and China, which is like one of the major exporting countries, it is a direct competitor to Mexico in the manufacturing industry. And so it could have a direct effect on the Mexican labor market, and which is not through the US manufacturing sector. And so, and there is some evidence of a negative direct effect of Chinese imports on Mexican employment, which could potentially like violate the exclusion restriction. So I don't know how you could address this, but if you could like, I'm not sure whether it's going to be too much of a concern also, like, you know, in terms of it might not just change your results or something, but it'll be good to address that.
Yeah, no, this is great. We really appreciate the feedback. I mean, this is one of our main concerns.
Right.
Like, is it satisfying the
Exclusion, yeah.
And so as Joaquin had mentioned, we're like looking into potentially like alternative ways of exploiting like two-stage squared. So one of the ideas, because I have that same concern, I wasn't so concerned about the Mexico component, but that's another thing that we need to think about. But I do have concern that there is, you know, still maybe some correlation with the unobservables there. And so our next steps are to like try to explore this imperfect instrumental variable approach, which would basically allows you to bound the estimates instead of providing like a point estimate, but and you're basically allowed to violate the exclusion restriction. But anyway, so we're kind of like exploring alternative routes to this particular instrument based on some kind of concerns that I had with the results too. So we appreciate that feedback, because we were hoping that, like, you know, what are people going to say? Like, are you buying this or are you not buying this? Right. So, so we really appreciate that.
Right.
So it's definitely a concern that we're going to have to, you know, address head on moving forward. And,
Right.
that's great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, but it's a very convincing story. Yeah, just these concerns, of course, would always be there. But yeah, this was my major concern. And there are a couple of minor things that it will be good if you can show the reduced form estimates as well, because like the title of your paper is related to the instrument. And so I did not see like a table of reduced form estimates, which would directly show us the effect of the Chinese trade competition on the Mexican employment or
yeah.
migration propensities.
That's
Yeah.
interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, because I had like, when I started reading the paper, I expected to, you know, see the reduced form effects, reduced form estimates.
There are
So,
other papers that have done that. And
Yeah.
so
right.
maybe we should try that. I think we discussed that at some
Mhm.
point. And
Yeah. As an additional check though. Yeah.
so
Yeah.
maybe a table on the appendix or something.
Mhm. Yeah.
Okay, that's great.
Just because the title says so. So yeah. Yeah. And also like, I'm not sure whether, if you could include time fixed effects also, like you're considering like 2 time periods, right?
Well, that
so-
two variables, just one.
Oh,
It's-
yeah,
it's in
that's a
the-
change. Okay,
So-
okay. Sorry about that. Yeah. And also there were a couple of notations that were confusing in the paper. So maybe if you could just address this specifically the part about the ICW. A couple of places I saw that there's an IT and there's an ST. So that's just a minor concern. Yeah. So
Right.
yeah, those were my comments. So,
Would you be willing to email me?
Sure.
the slides?
yes, I will email them. Yeah. But great work. And I look forward to seeing these, like when you've like worked on some of these. Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah,
So the time period is from 1983 to 2008 for the last.
1998 to 2008, yeah.
And there was also 2008, right?
Yeah, so we have two different specifications we're looking at. They're both long differences. We have a 1998 to 2003, which is kind of our short-term estimate, and then we have a 1998 to 2008, which is like our long-term estimate. And the reason why we're doing that is because of the data availability for some of the other variables that go into our instrument, right? And so, maybe you can speak to that.
Yeah, so in the case of the manufacturing labor measure, given the availability of data, we can only measure for in that 10-year period between 1998 and 2008. We can only measure it for 3 years. So those 2 years at the beginning of the period plus the 2003 at the middle, because the Mexican economic census gathers data only every 5 years. Other alternative sources of manufacturing labor measures in Mexico come at the monthly or with monthly or year frequency, but they're only about formal employment. And in Mexico, as in many other developing countries, informal labor is very relevant. And there is a lot of our measure of manufacturing labor would use a lot of precision only use these formal labor measures. But of course, there will be the advantage that we will be able to analyze a country with more granularity.
So my concern was that, as you're including 2007 and 8, so from 2007, there were more migrants, more written migrants than migrants to the US. So if that's the case, then if you include 2007 and 8, then that might be causing the decrease in the number of migration that you're seeing, the 3.6 that you're seeing.
So can you say again, what is the main concern there?
Due to increase in policy implication, more policies restricting immigrants, migrating to the United States. That might be one of the reasons that we're seeing decrease in the long-term effect.
Okay.
Because you split in 2007 and 8, and that's the time when migration decreased in general.
Okay.
So if you're looking at long-term effects, if you just look till 2006, maybe, not including 7 and 8, that might be
Right. So we don't get that option, as you were saying, because of our data availability. So we get data at every 5 years. So that's why we have to use the 2003 to 2000. The 1998, those are when the census for every 5 years. So unfortunately, we don't have data on 2007 or 6 that we can use to match in our regression. So we're basically limited to the availability of the next census data. So
your data from 1983 to 2008, or
so if we have data on during 1998, during 2003, and during 2000. So it's a long difference. Of course, it's not like a balance. It's not like a yearly panel. So yeah. So I appreciate that. It's interesting. I'm not aware that there was decrease in Mexican migration before 2010. I've only seen that it was after 2010. So I'm okay. Well, then yeah. Then okay. Yeah. So I mean, that could possibly. So do you have a suggestion about how we could control for that somehow in like a long difference approach?
this was not in 267, but as you
Okay.
said,
So it's not in there. So we're good. All right. All right. Okay. Okay, thank you guys so much. Thank you.
All right. So hi everyone. I'm Chin Xiao. Today I'm presenting this paper I had with Di Xiao, who is actually supposed He's supposed to present this. This is he's a labor guy, so I'm not not a labor guy. So he's supposed to present this like we're supposed to have the experiment done. Like we did a pilot last year in December, and we were supposed to run this experiment in January and February this year. But then you got COVID and in Wuhan, and there's a lot of lockdown, so we have to postpone. And I just got the data like 2 days ago, so that's why I had to rush for this. And I just made the slide this morning at 5 a.m. So I hope you guys won't be mad at me if I'm not that good. But yeah, this is like something we planned last year, and that's on the fertility discrimination in the Chinese labor market. I would like to start with Chinese MIM under the Chinese two-child policy. So a woman in the Chinese labor market, if you haven't had a child yet, employers treat you as an extraordinary ticking time bomb that explodes twice. One is for the pregnancy leave, the second is for the marital leave. So if you already had a child, you are a ticking bomb that could explode because you can't have a second child right now because of the two-child policy at any time. And then if you already gave birth to 2 or more, you're definitely too busy to take care of the kids. So you're not able to work. So it's very, very tough for women in the labor market. So I talked about that policy, like the two-child policy, but so I want to give a little bit of this introduction about the birth policy in China. So we have this one-child policy, which I think a lot of people might be a little bit aware that if you have a Chinese friend, they might not have any siblings because of that. So between 1980 and 2015, China restricts families to a single child to limit the population growth due to the overpopulation concern. Because during the 70s, China had this population boom, and they were concerned that they can't get enough food or to support them. So they had this very controversial population control policy that has numerous impact and has been widely studied actually for that. So that's the one-child policy. I'm one of the in that generation, so I was also affected. But that ended in 2016. Because of they have this new two-child policy comes up. China shift to this new limit of two children, and the reason for that is they don't have this overpopulation concern anymore. At that, like we have a lot more population, but we don't have the concern of not getting enough food. But now we have a new concern, which is that we have like decline in fertility, and which shrinks the labor pool, and also have a very rapid population aging issue that I will show in the next slide. So that the two-child policy it just wiped out the one-child policy, and that happened in 2016. And then in May 2021, like last year, they formally revised the law to allow couples to have 2 children, which they had called three children, which they called a three-child policy. But I don't use it because 2 months later, they just wiped out. You can have as many child you want, just the more the better. So that's the policies. And then here's the reason why that China has the one more child, want to increase the fertility rate. So you can see from these 2 graphs, this is like from 2010, and that's the prediction if like for the population distribution in 40 years from so it's like 30 years from now. So you can see that the shape has changing, like the age is like 100 to 0. Like you see that we have a lot more elderlies if we don't do any change in the 2050. And Chinese people older than 65 are expected to increase from 120 million to in 2010 to 329 million in 2050. So that's the issue. We want to avoid having that structure that doesn't look good, especially for the labor market, for all the retirement. So what the government did is they provided policies. Like the first one is just removing that one-child policy, right? Like they removed this family size limits. And after the two-child policy went into effect, at least from what we know, 30 of the China's 31 province, they increased their mandated maternity leave. For example, Hubei province, which is one of the province study we conducted our experiment, they increased from 98 days before before 2016 to 128 days, and then they eventually update that, increase that again for another 30 days to 158 days. Guangzhou province, they increased from 128 to 178 days. So you see, there's like after that, the policy by the government, the 2-child, the 3-child, they increased the length of the maternity leaves as a way to try to increase the fertility. For males, the paternity leaves doesn't change much. It's ranged from 15 to 30 days. For both Hubei and Guangdong, it's 15 days. So it doesn't have that much effects on male. And also the local authorities, study levels, they roll out subsidies for baby food, for housing and education, excuse me, as well as tax cut and cash rewards to promote this as a way to encourage. Finally, the Congress, not finally, but like Congress also tried to increase, to encourage marriage and childbirth during grad school period, which actually is one of the reasons that the study sample that we studied, we focused on grad students, is one of the reasons, because they're trying to like promote this. You get married in grad school, you know, you get child when you're a grad student. Like they have this proposed, and this is a very hot debate in the public, like in debate that happened in China. So did that work? This is the birth rate and death rate for China from 1990s to 2020. So you can see that the decline, the first half of the decline is mainly due to that 1-child policy, and then at 2016, which is the dashed line there, the black dashed line, it is when the 2-child policy happened, and we see there's a small spike increase at that period, but then it just goes down. Like you see this coming to a close, the difference between birth rate and death rate, which is, you know, the increase in population is coming to a negative. We call it negative increase in the population. So that's the 2021 data. Actually, the data from 2022, actually, that we see from several provinces in the first quarter of 2022, they report negative, like more death rate, more death than the birth rate. So that's a very pressing issue is continuing to happening right now. So there are a lot of studies on like why like there's low fertility rate, and like we'll figure out a way to increase, because that's one of the most critical policies that the government and Chinese government are trying to do. So in this study, we focus on one of the things for the labor market, which is the fertility discrimination in the labor market. We think that may be a factor that dampens the childbearing intention among women. So first, I want to give this brief definition from another paper that studies European countries on this. Like fertility discrimination here is referred to discrimination towards women with a higher probability of childbearing. So I'll give more the exact example in the experiment side slide later. And then I also want to say, after the 2-child policy went into effect, a majority of women surveyed by various Chinese companies, the women's group, reported that they have subject to gender and pregnancy-based discrimination when they pursue for the employment. So, you know, they're speaking out and saying that there's this issue, and the extended maternity leave policy coupled with the discriminatory hiring practice leads to women view multiple childbirth or giving childbirth and their successful career as a fundamentally incompatible. So this is like making them they usually have to decide on this. So making that may impact their fertility intention. So the objective of this paper is that we want to conduct a correspondence testing experiment and a campaign employer survey to examine how employment opportunities are affected by the applicants' probability of childbearing. So follow Becker, the paper who we cited for the definition of the fertility discrimination. We hypothesized that the single and childless applicants, because they're single, they haven't get married yet, but they have a lower risk of getting pregnancy than the married applicants. So that's like relatively that's if there's a difference, we are assuming there's we are inferring there's discrimination between those two. And then we do not have prior expectations on the difference between married and childless applicants and married with kids applicants, because we don't, because of the two-child policy. They can, even if they have kids, they can have more. So we don't know that, but we have that in our experiment. And then we also want to test for the potential mechanisms, which it's mostly it's given by the employer survey, but I wasn't able to dig deep into that because I just got data 2 days ago. So yeah, but I'll present very preliminary about the main point that we find. And we also want to explore the labor market side heterogeneity that which still in progress, but I will talk a little bit about it in the later slide. Oh, wow. Okay. So I want to give a preview of the results so it didn't get too boring. So we find that married women receive significantly fewer callbacks than single unmarried women, like single women. And the gap in the callbacks is much smaller and less different for men. So the issue is for women. And our supplemental employer survey so far that we examined shows consistent and supporting evidence. Hiring manager are concerned about the negative impact from the potential maternity leave, and their reference towards the probability of childbearing they stated that is a major factor for choosing single over married applicants when they did when we gave them the test of choosing which applicant they prefer and why, like what's the reason. So I'll show a little bit of that after in the later slide. So I want to first just introduce what is like this correspondence testing experiment and a little bit about the employee survey. So the correspondence testing methods involves in sending this carefully matched fake fake resumes to advertise job vacancies. So we're basically sending fake resumes. What it does is like there are a lot of good study on this, mostly focused on race and gender discriminations, and recently it has been used in some other like characteristics. So what this can do is it can reveal discriminatory practice at the initial stage of the recruitment. So the way we identify is better is whether we get to the first stage of interview. So it cannot. So it can. What it can do is it can identify causal relationship and determine if hiring discrimination varies by occupation and region, but it is constrained in what and how mechanism can be revealed. So that's the point that that's where we need this campaign employer survey, which is used to support this correspondent testing by providing additional evidence on the potential mechanism in a different setting and addressing the question that cannot be addressed there. So that's why we have this. So what we did is we asked hiring managers for the reason for their decision after the survey-based choice experiment. Okay. So here's the correspondence study design. Basically, we embed these family status signals in the self-assessment and adding it to the section. So we have 4 resumes for 2 females and 2 males, and then we randomly pick 2 from the family status there. Like we have single no kids, married no kids, married with kids, and for that, so we randomly select 4 resumes and to submit to each job. And these are the key characteristics that we randomize for each job in the resumes. In addition to that, we have, to make the resume look more real, we added a lot of other main characteristics. The sample that we use fresh graduates with a master's degree from top schools in the region because they're like competitive for entry-level jobs, and they're directly related with the Congress proposal on having this promoting childbirth at the grad school level. So that's why we picked that. And then the remaining characteristics are randomly drawn from a pool of real resumes. So we have I have an example of resume, but I wasn't able to put it in my slides. It's like we make sure it looks real. We make fake, we bought fake pictures that we make sure they look similar. Like we don't have that appearance variation much. Like we make sure they look like, real, and they don't have that appearance issue that that might sometimes might happen. And then we also register, like verify that's like this is a real person. We have 16 RAs on this project that help us to send the resumes. And then the source of the target job is pretty large and has been used in studies on corresponding studies in China, which is a nationally recognized online job board. It's called the 51job.com. It has listed on average, like there are 5 million unique vacancies on it. So it has been used for a lot of correspondence studies. So that website actually have, they are aware of that. So we had to have like a lot of that's why we need 16 RAs and have a long time period to make sure, we don't get caught by the system, because they're noticing that. So eventually it was planned in January and February, but we did it in June and July, and we submitted 18,728 resumes. So a lot of resumes we had, it was pretty hard work to keep track on all the RAs, but we made it. I should have a picture for them, but I wasn't able to add it this morning. But yeah, so we submitted that during these 2 periods. And then we focused on the program focused on economics and journalism and communication, and those are the sample job titles that we applied. We pick economics because it's one of the most popular jobs, that the majors that look for a job on the market. And then we pick communication and journalism because there's a majority of female students there. So that's the reason we picked these 2 programs that we applied to the jobs on this too. And then here's the results. Oh, I'm doing pretty good. So this is the callbacks rates by family status and gender. So the dash line there, the gray dash line, it is the average, the callback rates. We got a pretty good callback rate, so it's 14%. I think generally the correspondence studies, they usually get 10%. Some of the good ones, they get 20%. So we are in a good range, which means that our RAs did a good job there. So, but what we can see here is on the left is the callback rates for women, and the right is men. And then we see for women, we see this is very obvious 6% difference in callback between single women with no kids and married women with no kids. So with which we refer as with higher probability of childbearing. But we don't see that for men. We see for men, it's you get higher callbacks with kids. So one of our next step is do regression analysis on this. We cluster the job, we use job fix effects and cluster the standard errors, and then we add in the controls to do that again. But this is what we got for just tabulate the summary statistic there, and which already shows there is difference in this callback rates, and signaling there might be some discrimination in the probability of fertility discrimination that we refer to. So we also find this in the employer survey. So what we did there is hiring managers. We recruit about 600 of them. We asked them to choose from 6 otherwise identical candidates for interview. So we let them know that here's 6 candidates. They have everything else, they're different, but they're the same. We set everything same, but we have the only difference is that you either choose male, female, and single, married with no child, married child. So we have those and let them pick their choice decision. And then what we find out is 72% of the hiring managers choose single over married female applicants. We haven't this is just I take out the male for now because I was rushing for this result to present, but this is what we got for the female applicants. We see 72% in our HR survey, they selected that. And among those 72%, 78% report their preference toward the probability of childbearing as the major factor of their choice. So they're pretty candid. They just tell that's the reason, I thought they're gonna hide their, they just hide it, pretend that they don't care, but they don't think of that. But yeah, and 68% of the hiring managers are concerned about the negative impacts from that. 68% of all hiring managers, okay, the ones either they pick or not pick, they all are concerned about this, the potential negative impact from the marital leave that might happen. And this is not the case for 21% of hiring managers are concerned about the paternity leave. So like, they're concerned more about for the leave for the way longer leave for the woman. So the ongoing work that we're doing right now is like we gotta work more on the data that we just got. Like I'm gonna meet with him tomorrow, and then we investigate the labor market side heterogeneity. So what we do want to do is we want to see the callback difference by the firm ownership, whether it is a foreign firm, local firm, government owned. That makes the difference. Whether because there's a lot of policy and there's law actually permitting you cannot discriminate. And then this is the one. And then the firm side, whether it's a bigger firm, a small firm, post salary. If it's higher salary jobs, the loss from getting that maternity leave is higher, right? And then also we got suggestions for like the gender of the CEO, the distribution of the like the gender distribution of the firm, which we're collecting data on that as well. So to understand more about what the firm side understands. And then we're thinking of conduct a survey on job applicants to see what they are thinking, like what's their concern to just get this picture more complete. We did a pilot in December last year, and we were just getting a lot of like concerns from female students on that. So we just need to do like a formal one, and that's on the next step. And then we might, if there's policy change, which might happen, this is a way we can do a different diff in the correspondence study, which is actually a new method that we can take out some of the concerns and do another round of the correspondence experiment after a policy change, if that can happen. There's a recent paper using this published in the Journal of Labor Economics using the same experiment, like similar setting, but with that method. So we're thinking of applying that. And yeah, and that's all I have. I'm sorry I was kind of rushed and I don't have a lot of results, but thank you all. And if you have any question, comments, it's good to ask me now, and also can email me. Thank you. Any questions? I know, sorry, I just got the slide, so no one will be my discussant, but so I can just take. Okay.
Labor economists have these distinctions between types of some of the discrimination and discrimination. That's like, it would be interesting to differentiate between discrimination and discrimination. Is there anything in the survey that?
Yeah.
Well, the reason I said what I said is because actually like costs more, whatever, or if you could buy.
Yeah, that's a good. We actually have that in the HR, like the hiring manager one, because but I just did. We asked their we asked their gender, so we know whether they're female and male or like making the decision. We asked if it's their preference or it's their boss. This is like it was the supervisor's decision or the company's decision, and whether they're concerned about other factors. And we have that list of questions. It's just that we haven't finished cleaning that data, so it's we want to make this like a. I need to do so. Like I need to talk with everyone here. Like just know more people. Networking a little bit. But yeah, this is yeah. But I'm also mad at him because I've waited so long for him to just give me the data. He's like, there's a lot of challenges. Like students are hard to do. Like they're saying they did a good job. I'm like, yeah, thanks. Yeah, that's yeah. Yep.
Quite impressive if you've only had the data for 2 days, like pulling them together, interesting and compelling. And I look forward to seeing where this goes.
Thank you.
But I just have a quick question, just so on the resumes you send out, can people put like what their marital status and their and is that a normal thing to do?
Yeah, that's the question we got like when we set it up. And actually what we did is it's actually extra thing that we add, but before we do that, we asked a lot of like HRs. We did remember we have like a pilot survey, and in that survey we asked randomly selected about 200 HRs in China, and we asked if that's gonna like make them think the resume has an issue, or is that typical, is that okay? They said it's not very typical, but if it's on it, they won't care about it like very HR, but they will notice it. So they won't say this on, they won't identify that as a fake resume. So that's all like where. No information. Yep. Yes. Yeah.
more information. But, you know,
That it would be bad, yeah.
Yeah, I think that's also, yeah, something we noticed after we ran the experiment. We were like, oh dear, come on, there's a paper recommending we should have like a reference, like nothing on it. And I was like, can we do it? That's too late, but maybe we can do it next round. Yeah, that's definitely something where I think that make it help. Yeah. Yep.
If there is a law against discrimination, and when our manager HR is saying that, openly saying that, you know, this is the reason we're not hiring. So is it because it has some political connection?
You mean for the HRs or what, like?
They're representing, is it because they have political connections, they know that something will happen to them?
That I don't know actually. I don't think it will be the public. It's just their own, like it maybe they just aware that no one's gonna, you know, catch them, and they just think it's not, you can't say if you're discriminated or not. Like it cannot be easily revealed unless you test for that. Like something that usually that's what what we think are happening. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just thinking of the kind of jobs that, like.
Yeah.
In the sample, so like, there might be some jobs which offer more flexible working hours versus those who don't offer flexibility in terms of working hours. So like, is there a good mix of both kinds, or like, because you consider two kinds of
Yes.
majors, right?
Yeah. Yeah, we have collected very detailed information on each job, like what's the job description, how many description they have, you know, like, and then also their company information, like whether it's a long-term job, also like long-term, like short-term, you know, we just haven't explored that factor. I think I think if we can, like, we would think of adding more jobs so we can get more, you know, difference and explore those heterogeneities in the application. So yeah, that's something we're gonna do next. Actually, a lot of things to do, a lot of work. Thank you. You good? All right. Any other questions or comments? Okay, I think we're pretty good. Thank you.